Well, CVD, or color vision deficiency, is a condition that impacts 1 in 12 males and roughly 1 in 200 females. And for those of you who have this condition, or those of you who have heard of this condition, it limits an individual's ability to see color. Some of you might know this better as color blindness. Sean and I were visiting in the staff room a few weeks ago, and I was surprised to find out that Sean actually struggles with color blindness. He was telling me that when he's out with his family and there's a rainbow that they can see, he can only see 3 colors on a rainbow, where most of us are able to see 7 different colors. Now just think about that for a minute. What do you think it would be like not to be able to see full, brilliant colors? Kevin, Doug, Sheila, and Rudy were in Gimli a few weeks ago at a pastor's conference. And they were sending back these beautiful pictures of the sunsets and the sunrises from out there. And the pictures really were stunning. And again, I wondered, what would it be like not to be able to see the colors of a sunset or the colors of a sunrise? What would it be like not to be able to see the colors in a rainbow? What would it be like not to be able to see the colors in the fall as all of the trees around us turn from green to different shades of brown and red? This medical condition is often genetic. And although there are certain types of color blindness that allow some people to see some colors, there's also a kind called monochromacy that can remove a person's ability to see any type of color at all. These individuals live in a world where all they can see is black and white, and everything around them is seen in various shades of gray. But one of the great things that's happened over the last 20 years is that technology has actually created a pair of glasses that will allow people who struggle with this condition to see color, often for the very first time. And chroma glasses were created or invented by accident in 2002 by Dr. McPherson, Donald McPherson, who was attempting to develop lenses that would protect surgeons as they were performing laser surgery. And today, although very expensive, these glasses can help people to see color for the very first time. Maybe you've seen this too, but there's some videos floating around on social media that record the moment that colorblind people are able to see color for the first time. And it truly can be a very emotional experience. And here's a couple of my favorites. It's coming. We having some trouble back there? That's okay. 1, 2, 3. Still different?
Mom, you gotta get in there too. That is so awesome. I told you it's gonna be a little emotional.
Okay, pretty sure I heard a few sniffles out there, and that's just fine. But you know, it really is incredible what can happen when you view the world through a different set of lenses. Well, you might be wondering what all of this has to do with the passage that you've just heard. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a number of issues in Scripture that our 21st century Christians, as 21st century Christians, that we tend to filter through our pair of 21st century North American evangelical lenses. And I'd like to suggest to you this morning that in order for us to truly understand what this particular passage has for us, that we need to start by taking off those glasses and by putting on a pair of first century Middle Eastern glasses. In order to do that, we need to go back and remind ourselves of why Peter wrote this letter in the first place. Back when we introduced this letter a few weeks ago, we talked about how Peter was writing to a group of people who had fled their homes because of persecution. They left all that they knew and had fled to the area that we now know as Turkey. And it was with this move, it came with an introduction to a new culture. And with that new culture came new traditions and new customs. And with those new customs and traditions came new challenges to these committed Christians' faith. And we know that Peter wrote this letter to encourage them, but he also wrote it to help them to find a resilient kind of hope within the restless world that they were now surrounded by. And I like to think that at some level, we can all appreciate what that struggle must have been like, because we all live in a multicultural community. I mean, we're all part of an ethnically diverse church. We live in a city that welcomes people from all over the world. We live in a country that enthusiastically welcomes people who want to immigrate here from other countries. And this is something that we celebrate. We celebrate that diversity. I mean, many of us love going to Folklorama each year, where we have the opportunity to experience some of what it would be like to live in those other countries. But within this particular culture that Peter is writing to, just as it was in the Roman Empire, the particular lens that this society's glasses had a very low view of women. Women in the first century were defined by the men in their lives. Women were deemed not worthy of educating, so most of them couldn't read or write. Women were subject to the authority of the men in their lives, their father before they were married, and that switched to their husband after they were married. It was the husband, and only the husband, who had legal rights of the children. And in most cases, if the husband died, the wife didn't even have any legal right to any of his possessions or even to the children. And when we read a passage like this one that speaks of the role of a wife, we have to be careful what pair of glasses we're using to define our takeaways. Because when Peter was addressing this group of struggling Christians, he was intending to offer advice that would help them to solve a very real problem that these very real Christians were trying to navigate their way through. They had a problem, and here Peter is offering them a prescription to that. Look at it this way. So if you have a headache and you decide to go to the doctor, think of all that the doctor could say to you in terms of diagnosing it. He could say it was something you ate. He could say it was from a lack of sleep. He could say it was caused by staring at the TV or the computer or your phone screen for too long. It could be a food sensitivity. It could be an allergy. It could be that you're stressed out. And it could be something more serious, like a tumor. And all you know when you go see that doctor is that you have a headache. And any one of those things could be the cause of it. But how you end up treating the root cause of that headache would be very different, right? Depending on the diagnosis. So here are these persecuted Christians. They're coming to Peter and they're saying, help us to understand what we should do when our spouse is actively hostile towards our faith. Help us to understand what God would want us to do when our spouses are not happy about our decision to follow Christ. Help us to understand how to reflect Jesus well when our spouse is not a believer. And please, please, Peter, help us to understand what it means to navigate our way through this new culture that comes with all kinds of new expectations related to the husband's and wife's role in a marriage. And Peter isn't writing a general prescription to all of those who are married. He's writing a prescription to address this specific cultural issue. And what we have to understand here is that in this specific situation that Peter is describing, both the husband and wife have heard the gospel, and while one of them responded by making a commitment to Christ, the other didn't. And Peter's offering these husbands and wives some guidance on how to deal with that specific scenario. And I will tell you, there is a profound universal truth in this passage for those of us who have unsaved family and friends. But we have to be careful that we're understanding the context before we can accurately apply the truth. So he starts off in verse 1 by saying this. He says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct." And it's interesting that this passage opens with the word likewise. The New International Version translate that word as meaning in the same way. And we know that when we see that particular term, it's much like when we talked about the word therefore a few weeks ago. We need to understand that what has just been said relates to what is about to be said, because this word is acting as a connecting point between two thoughts. And so before we can understand what Peter's about to say, we have to look back at what he has already said. And if you remember what Tim spoke about last week, just before Peter writes these words in chapter 3, he reminds this persecuted church of what it means to represent Jesus well in a persecuting culture. And he says this in chapter 2, starting in verse 13. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." Verse 15, "For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." So that's what Peter has just finished saying in chapter 2. And he's reminding them that representing Jesus well in a culture that is actively hostile towards you starts by you realizing that you are still subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And he goes on to say, "For this is the will of God." So just sit and chew on that for a few minutes. And this is what Peter is directing towards all of the committed Christ followers that are part of this faith community. So we shouldn't be surprised that he now starts telling this group to live lives of submission towards one another. But now he takes this whole conversation about submission or being subject to, and he applies it to these struggling marriages. So the first point that Peter is making here is that these wives need to learn what it means in the context that he's just talked about to be subject to their unbelieving husbands. And again, he says to them, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct." And the first thing that strikes me about this passage is that Peter's main focus is on that husband coming to faith. And his emphasis and his main point and the ultimate goal of this shift that he is suggesting that wives make is that the husband will eventually come to the same saving knowledge of Christ that the wife has come to. So the question being asked is, what's the best way for him, having initially rejected the gospel, to have his heart softened to Jesus? That is the question that Peter is trying to help these wives understand. And the first piece of guidance that Peter gives these wives is that they should remember that just as we are subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, for this is the will of God, as it says in chapter 2, and just as we are called to live lives of submission to one another, he says, in the same way, or likewise, learn what it means to be subject to your husbands. It's also interesting to note that the word that your Bible translates as be subject to, or again, some of your translations use the word submit. It's actually a verb in the original Greek. And the literal translation of that word means to voluntarily arrange yourself under the authority of somebody else. In other words, this isn't something that's being imposed on you, but it's something that's coming out of who you are or what of Christ is doing in your life. And in this case, the greater purpose, as Peter is talking about, is that these wives would eventually have their husbands come to a faith in Jesus. And I may be reading more into this, but when you study this whole subject of submitting in the New Testament, you almost begin to see Peter as well as Paul talking about that issue as if it was a spiritual discipline that all of us need to work at developing. As often happens when I'm preparing a message, and this likely won't surprise you, I often spend time going down these interesting theological rabbit holes as I'm reading through the passage. And this whole concept of submission is an interesting one to study from the New Testament. And if you're ever looking for an interesting concept to study or an interesting word, the word itself is used 12 times in the New Testament. And it occurs to me when we think about that word submit, in our culture it so often carries a derogatory connotation to it, doesn't it? In fact, I think when somebody submits, oftentimes in our culture, we see that as a sign of weakness. But understand that that's not the case in the New Testament. In fact, when it's used in the New Testament, it's usually a demonstration of trust or a demonstration of obedience, and especially when it's used in a Christian context. Submission primarily involves submitting to God's will and his authority, as well as to humbly relating to others in various roles and relationships where they may happen to have a role that is above ours. And when Peter talks here about that, he's not so much talking about it as a behavior that we need to adopt, as much as he's suggesting this is a way of life that we all need to embrace. And again, just think about that for a minute. Think about the implications of that. And the problem is that many of us have a hard time taking off our North American glasses and seeing through the lenses that Peter is seeing this problem through. So Peter's reminding these wives that actions speak louder than words as it relates to their unbelieving husbands. And that a great way for their hearts to be softened to the gospel is for them to realize their role in being subject to them. But the second thing that Peter offers to these wives relates to how they think about their physical appearance. And again, don't miss the point of what Peter is saying here. He's saying in the midst of learning to be subject to and in the midst of trying to help your husband come to faith, he says this starting in verse 3. He says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Verse 5, For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. The Greek word translated in this verse as adorning is kosmos, from which we get the word cosmetic. And it literally means to have an orderly arrangement consisting of material things that are designed to draw attention to yourself. And the point that Peter's trying to make here is that who you are should have less to do with what's on the outside and much more to do with what is happening on the inside. I really do love the way Eugene Peterson's The Message translates this particular passage. It says, what matters is not your outer appearance, the styling of your hair, the jewelry you wear, the cut of your clothes, but your inner disposition. Cultivate inner beauty, the gentle, gracious kind that God delights in. You know, about half of Monica's extended family came from a more Mennonite background. I've often found it interesting how different evangelical faith communities have chosen to interpret passages like this one, and there's a few others similar to this in Scripture. You know, some have even used this passage as a way of condemning going to the salon or women braiding their hair or even wearing jewelry. And I know for some in Monica's family, things like getting their ears pierced had been turned into a theological issue, again, partially based on passages like this one. And when you understand the context of this passage and the point that Peter is trying to make, you quickly see that he's not trying to suggest that there's anything wrong with those things. The point that he's trying to get across to these struggling wives is the same message that for those of us who are parents and grandparents, we hope will be instilled in all of our daughters and our granddaughters. And simply put, Peter's reinforcing this idea that they need to be spending more time investing into the imperishable beauty that they all have. Peter's reminding these wives that just because their culture and their society place such a high priority on exterior beauty, don't forget that what God cares about and what he values is the interior and what's being stirred and created in their heart through their relationship with Jesus. And Peter's telling them that in the midst of trying to live out your faith in front of their pre-Christian husband, he says, let them see the difference that Jesus can make in a person's life. Show them. Peter says, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. He goes on to talk about Sarah and how she really was the perfect example of this. In fact, he's saying if you're looking for an example to follow, if you're looking for a role model, or if you're looking to flesh out what it means to become this kind of a wife, Peter says you don't have to look any further than Sarah. So Peter's advice to these struggling wives is to learn what it means to be subject to their husbands and learn what it means to embrace an imperishable beauty. But Peter also goes on to speak to husbands, and although there's some discussion about this from scholars, most of them believe that the husbands being spoken to here were those who have unbelieving wives. So Peter's just given advice to wives whose husbands were not believers, and now he's going to offer advice to husbands whose wives are not believers. People often wonder why there would be 6 verses dedicated to wives and only 1 dedicated to husbands. Okay, tell me you've asked that question. A lot of us have when we've read this. And the reason is because the scenario that's being set up in verse 7 was a much more unique scenario. Because in that particular culture, when a husband would come to Christ, the whole household would also come to faith as well, most often. But just because there's only one verse dedicated to this, the advice is still incredibly important. And the first thing he says to these struggling husbands is that they need to learn to be more understanding. He says in verse 7, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. And we have to acknowledge again here that we are speaking to a culture that's very different than our North American culture. We're kind of eavesdropping into a cultural conversation here, and part of it's foreign to us. A culture, as we said earlier, where women were defined by the men in their lives, where women were not educated, where most of them couldn't read or write, where they weren't treated the way that they should have been treated. And Peter is bringing something new to the table here, and it's as if he's saying, man, don't treat your wives like that. And he's holding out hope that the wife will come to a saving knowledge of Christ like the husband already has. And he's saying to these husbands that a great way to create an environment in your home that's conducive for that to happen is for you to be more understanding. In fact, I think it's hard for us to pick up on this here, but part of what Peter is trying to communicate is don't treat your wives in the same way that most husbands in that culture treat them. Some translations use the word considerate rather than understanding in this particular verse. In fact, the NIV says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. And often when we're reading this, it's easy to just skim right through that and miss the significance of what that word means. But in the Greek, it carries with it this idea of consider them in all that you do. It carries with it this idea that in every decision you make that affects your family, you should consider them. Put their interest ahead of yours. Give their thoughts and opinions weight. The Apostle Paul, in a similar type of passage, tells husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, to place the needs of their wives ahead of their own, to be willing to lay down their lives for their wives. And that verse has become commonplace for us to hear today, but when we are able to see what that would have meant to wives through a pair of first century Middle Eastern glasses, the implications of what that would have meant to these wives would have been liberating. So Peter tells these husbands to learn to be understanding, but he also tells them something else. He says, learn to show honor. Again, he says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Okay, I know, it's hard for a lot of us who are still wearing our 21st century North American glasses to get beyond that whole weaker vessel comment, right? But please don't lose sight of what Peter is attempting to communicate here. This was a reality of the culture. And in this culture, more of the physical labor was generally done by the men. But the point that Peter is attempting to drive home here to these husbands is that while their wives may not be as physically strong as them, that doesn't mean that they're inferior. And this would have been, again, a liberating statement back then. And Peter says, they are heirs with you of the grace of life. And again, think about what Peter's communicating there. He's trying to communicate to these husbands that they need to be treating their wives as co-heirs. The culture had already dictated that they couldn't own property. You know, the culture had already dictated that they couldn't be the recipient of an estate should their father or their husbands pass away. The culture had already dictated that it just wasn't even worth educating them or teaching them to read or write. But they were equals as it relates to being heirs in this new kingdom that Jesus came to establish. The Message translation puts this particular verse this way, and I love it. It says, "Be good husbands to your wives, honor them, delight in them. As women, they lack some of your advantages, but in the new life of God's grace, you're all equals." And Peter's telling these husbands whose wives have not yet made a commitment to Christ that they need to communicate through a considerate and understanding heart that they are co-heirs in this new kingdom that Jesus came to usher in. I love how Peter follows this up, but you're going to have to wait till next week's message to hear that. You know, I didn't start wearing glasses until I was probably in my mid-30s. Up until that point, my eyesight had been very good, but something just started to happen in my mid-30s, and I was getting headaches and went to an optometrist, and they said that I needed glasses. My need for help in seeing became obvious. And I don't know where you're at this morning, but you know, the longer that I am a committed follower of Jesus, the more I find myself praying that I would have the kind of prescription in my spiritual glasses that are perfectly aligned with what the Lord sees. You know, rather than praying, "Lord, help me with this," or "help me with that," or "please provide this," I find that my prayers are now often that I would have the eyes to see situations and the eyes to see people as He sees them. I guess my prayer for all of us this morning is that we would long for glasses that would give us a perfect 2020 spiritual vision. So that when we see people and we're in the middle of navigating our way through a difficult situation, that we wouldn't be distracted by the preconceived ideas that come from looking at the world through our human set of lenses. But that we would all see the world, we would all see situations that come up in our lives, and that we would all see the people around us through a very different set of glasses. My prayer is that He would give us what we need to see the world and to see the people around us through His eyes.